Hello, I'm Catherine Byers-White, your host of the Los Altos History Show. We have a very interesting show planned for you this evening that includes a fashion show of vintage clothing that almost spans the century. All the models are Los Altans, and I know you'll recognize many of the models, so please stay tuned. We're talking this evening with the owner of this very special collection, Mary Carol Burdett. Welcome, Mary Carol.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's good to have you. Mary Carol has lived in Los Altos for 13 years and has served on the Historical Commission for the city. She spent her professional career in education as a teacher, elementary school principal, director of education for the Redwood City School District, and finally as a consultant. Mary Carol, I understand that as a historical commissioner that you're in charge of the essay contest for elementary school students.
Yes, and I've enjoyed it very much. Our new contest for 1994 is currently in progress, and I am acting as a consultant for that. I also serve on the Education Committee of the History House Association, and that works in conjunction with the Historical Commission.
Wonderful. I wanted to ask you about how this passion for clothing started. You and your husband have been collecting for years, I understand. And where did this all begin?
Well, it really began with my mother, who had quite a passion for amateur theatricals, and she started this collection of clothing which began with the Victorian era. And we had some very, very lovely things, including a beautiful leg of mutton sleeved blouse. And we had some things from the Hollywood studios because my uncle was treasurer of Warner Brothers Motion Picture Studios, and he used to get costumes and props from the department when they were finished with films, and my mother would take those, and we had them all in big trunks in our basement. And it was a beautiful collection until the floods of 1933, and the trunks floated around in the basement, and the costumes were damaged beyond repair. So we sort of started all over again, and we began to save clothing from each of the decades that had a special meaning to our family. So that's what you'll be seeing in the fashion show.
So that's what got this whole thing started, huh?
That's right. And then I carried on, and one of my daughters was a fashion designer and teacher of theater arts at Kenyatta College, and she kept the collection going too.
I know that you're originally from Southern California, and that you started the collection down there. And can you give me a little more information about how that all started in terms of, you say your mother began collecting?
Yes, I think the clothing is representative of Los Altos as well as Southern California, because even though there are regional differences, you will find that the clothing throughout California was pretty much the same.
So something worn in Los Altos would also be worn in Southern California or New York, or?
Yes, the fashion industry really took its cues from France until just recently, and women looked to Paris and to a lesser extent to New York, and now to the West Coast designers for their fashion sense. It follows throughout the United States about a year after the trends in Paris, but I think you'll find that the California styles, even though there were regional differences, were pretty much the same all over the United States.
What do you think the fashions can tell us about the society in which people lived at that time?
We have always been able to follow societal trends with fashion, or vice versa. And I think if you start with the Victorian times, for example, you will find a very rules-oriented society, and you will find people dressing. The women, of course, were covered from head to toe and wore large hats, one of which you'll see later in the fashion show. And you will find a very constricting type of fashion which typified the Victorian era. Then as you move through the Edwardian to the flapper, the era of the 20s, this of course was the era of the liberation or the emancipation of women. So of course skirts were shortened, hair was bobbed, and you find a very free and liberated feeling in the costume. The 30s reflected the Great Depression, and you found rather subdued clothing in the 30s. The 40s also reflected the war, World War II. It was very difficult to get fabric, and my wedding dress is a good example of that. We were asking a friend of the family, a dressmaker, to make my dress, but we couldn't find any fabric. And so my uncle, who was with Warner Brothers, as I already mentioned, managed to get 9 yards of white satin left over from a wedding dress that had been made for Jennifer Jones in one of her films. And so my dressmaker had a very hard time fashioning a wedding dress out of 9 yards with a train, and she finally ended up with short sleeves. And because in the 40s no bride appeared without sleeves, my mother then hunted for long white kid gloves to cover up my arms so that I would be in fashion and correct at that time. So you'll find that throughout the decades. The 50s reflected the cookie cutter look, with women who were primarily child rearing and homemaking, wearing the Harriet Nelson, the Ozzie and Harriet fashions, and the June Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver, the little Peter Pan collars and the big full skirts with poodles on them. Then in the 60s, you'll find clothing reflected some of our sadness, the assassinations, the riots, and then of course we moved into the 70s, where we had the anti-establishment clothing of the hippies, the flower children, the long dark dresses and the love beads and the headbands and the jackets, which really was the precursor of the grunge look that we have today. And then of course we moved into the power look, the power dressing of the 80s, the women who were on the corporate ladders climbing up, dressing like men, wearing their formal suits with the big shoulder pads and the small bow at the neck, the Diane Feinstein bow, to relieve the stiffness of the clothing.
Well, you mentioned the 50s, and I think of the poodle skirts. And I know different clothing is indicative of a time, but the poodle skirts seem to be something that was very, very different. And
well, yes, it was very trendy, just as the A-line dress or the trapeze or the chemise or the different styles. But there have always been trends in fashion, and your designers and your manufacturers are very aware of these. One of them is the gammon look, another is the romantic look, another is the sports, the tailored, and another is the classic look. And these trends go they're cyclical, and they go every few years, and your designers will follow those trends. The really classic clothes will last, and you'll sometimes read in the San Francisco Society section about a society matron who has worn a dress to the opera opening that she had 30 years ago. And that's because it's a real classic and has stood the test of time.
So the classics are ones that will be here forever, hopefully.
Right, right.
And then the trendy, it seems like now that we have some of the 60s look coming back.
That's right.
With the bell bottoms.
That's what the influence is. One of the things that I think you can see in the dresses of the 30s is what Mrs. Gilbert Smith probably wore She was the owner of History House, what we call our History House now today. And she probably wore a dress like this one that you will see in the fashion show that my mother is wearing here. This is a lace and chiffon afternoon dress. And in the 20s and 30s, women wore these when they called on their friends or when they were called upon, and when they served afternoon tea. And my mother here is holding me as an infant on her lap in 1925, wearing the dress that you'll see later in the fashion show.
That is beautiful.
I'm sure Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Gilbert Smith might have worn something quite similar to this.
Yes, I could see
You
that.
also have in this photograph, this is the wedding portrait of my mother and father from 1913. And my mother's wedding dress was very Edwardian in feeling in 1913. It was made of French silk, and it had a hobbled skirt, which was typical of the times. And then the lace collar on the dress was Brussels lace. It was removed in 1945 so that it could be made into the cap for my wedding veil. And so we then substituted a collar on this dress from my mother's collection of antique lace collars. So we had plenty to choose from to replace the one that was put into my headpiece, because we still have that intact, which I'm hoping maybe my grandchildren will wear for their weddings.
Wonderful story, Mary Carroll.
This picture was taken the day before her wedding, as was the custom in 1913, and she's holding a fake bouquet of flowers. She carried a small nosegay in reality of Cecil Bruner roses and lilies of the valley, but here she's carrying a big photographer's paper bouquet.
Almost looks real.
Yes, yes.
That's lovely. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you, do you find nowadays that men and women are slaves to fashion like they once were, or how's it different
I don't
now?
believe so. My oldest daughter, Carol Lorraine, is a fashion image consultant, and she has told me of the many trips that she has made with her clients into the department stores to find fashions that are right for them, based on their body type and on their coloring and on their own personal choice. So when she takes a client into the stores, rather than being a slave to what Paris or New York or even San Francisco has laid down as the fashion of the day, she will look for clothing that is suited to the personal type.
The personality,
and the
shape of the
type.
body.
Right.
What about the 90s? What do you think it's shaping up to look like in terms of fashion?
It seems to be much more of an individual matter, and people are, hemlines are of all different lengths. People can choose whether they wear the mini skirt depending on their age and their shape, or whether they want the long calf length skirt. And I think that you will find the 90s a very relaxed time. You will find the trends such as grunge and the Annie Hall look come and go very quickly, and you can tell by what's on sale in the department stores. When you see racks of grunge clothing on sale, you know that they didn't sell well. And they're not the kind of thing I collect. I should explain to you that my collection is really a family collection rather than a museum collection. There is nothing in here that would be worthy of preserving in a museum, because each of the pieces of clothing that I have kept has a story behind it and has a family connection, and that's why it's important to us.
Well, that's wonderful. Without any further ado, I want to get to the collection because it's absolutely beautiful. Please stay with us. We have a beautiful fashion show for you. We'll see you in a moment. Now's the moment we've all been waiting for. We finally get a look at these beautiful fashions. Let me start with our first model, Trish Mitchell, and she is wearing a Victorian dress and hat. And Mary Carroll, I understand the hat is authentic. Is that right?
That's true. It belonged to my great aunt Mamie, and she wore it at the turn of the century, probably with a leg of mutton blouse and a long black skirt. The dress was made by my oldest daughter, Carol Lorraine, for a requirement of her master's degree in theater arts at San Francisco State University. The costume is authentic to the period, but it was made in the 70s when Carol Lorraine was taking her master's degree. It works very well with the hat because of the colors in the hat and the dress. The little beaded bag and the lace mitts were owned by my husband's grandmother, Blanche Burdett, who lived in the Pacific Northwest.
Now, where would you wear something like this, Mary Carol?
Well, the Victorian women wore the concealed clothing both day and evening. I think this probably was a dressy dress that would have been worn more for parties than in the daytime.
That's beautiful. Our next model is Jerry Patkey, and Jerry is wearing your mother's wedding dress from 1913.
That's right. My parents were married just after the turn of the century. This dress is very Edwardian in feeling. It's made of French silk with a chiffon over panel and has a hobbled skirt. And it originally had a Brussels lace collar. And in 1945, the collar was removed from this wedding dress and made into a cap for my wedding veil. So then we wanted to keep the dress in feeling, and so we added an antique lace collar from a collection of lace collars that my mother owned so that we could still use the dress as a fashion piece. My mother carried a bouquet of Cecil Bruner roses and lilies of the valley.
And that dress has really held up well over the years. It's
really
quite delicate. But
considering how old it is and considering the type of fabric.
oh, that's absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Jerry. Our next model is John Geschke, and John's wearing top hat and tails that belong to your father.
That's right. In the 1920s, my father sang with a choral group in Los Angeles called the Ellis Club, and all of the men wore the tails and the top hat for their appearances. This was a classical music group and was very formal in their presentations. The coat and trousers are pure wool and have held up beautifully, as has the top hat, which has the beaver top, and have held up very well for almost 70 years.
That's really nice. Looks very dapper. Thank you, John. Our next model is Marge Bruno, and Marge is our mayor here in Los Altos, and she's wearing a flapper dress, and this was your mother's dress.
That's right. You can see that the fashions in the 20s reflected the emancipation of women by the short skirts, the sleeveless tops, and you can just picture Marge doing the Charleston in this dress. This was a party dress from the 20s, and although my mother wasn't a swinger, I can see that she probably enjoyed having that dress to wear out for special occasions.
Oh, that's lovely.
It's made of chiffon, orange chiffon.
Isn't it amazing that dresses aren't that short nowadays?
That's right. That's right.
Thank you. Our next model is Pinky Whalen, and Pinky's wearing a 20s dress.
Yes, this also belonged to my mother, and she wore this for afternoon tea when she was entertaining or when she was being entertained. And the lace and chiffon was very popular. The hat is made of horsehair and was also very popular style in the 20s. We have a portrait, which you saw earlier in the show, of my mother holding me as an infant on her lap, and she is wearing this dress. That's how we're able to authenticate the time period.
Is the lace handmade?
I'm not sure about that. It does almost look as though it was European.
It certainly does.
European lace and embroidery.
Oh, that's a beautiful. Would that would be a sundress?
I think an afternoon tea dress. Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much. Our next model is Liz Nyberg, and Liz is wearing a 30s dress with a hat. And what can you tell me about this?
Well, the cloche hat was very popular in the 30s, as was this printed chiffon, which belonged to my husband's great-aunt Grace. Now, this style you will see today. It's been copied in the 90s, and I think this kind of dress could have very well been worn by Mrs. Gilbert Smith, who was the owner of History House here in Los Altos. if she were entertaining or going to tea or having someone in, or perhaps even going to church on Sunday morning.
The colors are beautiful. Let me ask you, where do you store your
Well, we have
garments?
garment bags, and my husband's closet was preempted for this collection, and we have about 4 garment bags that we keep them in, and we keep them carefully sealed up as best we can to keep them away from moths and from damage.
Thank you, Liz. And our next model is Heidi Kuhn. Heidi is wearing a slate blue coat and hat that you wore in 1945.
This was part of my trousseau. I was married in February of 1945, and the caracool lamb hat and tuxedo front of the coat were very typical of the 40s. The coat actually has very classic lines, and if it were politically correct, could probably be worn today.
Oh, you're talking about the lamb collar.
The fur.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. But the
style is definitely...
The style is very, very classic. Fashion has been described as change, but style is something different. Style is the little black dress with the pearls that we think of as always being in style. Fashion changes, but this is a very stylish outfit.
Thank you, Heidi. And our next model is Gary Kuhn. And Gary is wearing a Marine's uniform that belonged to your husband. He wore it in World War II.
That's right. My husband was in the first division of the United States Marines and served in the South Pacific, and this was his officer's uniform. It was issued to him in Quantico, Virginia, and that's probably why he has a very heavy greatcoat that Gary is carrying, which is wool, and I can't imagine that he took it to the South Pacific, but knowing the Marines, I'm sure he was required to bring that heavy outfit with him for the tropical climate in the South Pacific. He still has, my husband still has his medals and his lieutenant bars, and I have to say that I don't think he can fit into the uniform anymore.
Thank you very much, Gary. Our next model is Patty Williams, and boy, is this a breathtaking dress. What can you tell me about this dress?
Well, our very attractive council member from Los Altos is wearing a very special dress. It was made for me by a very dear friend as a way of thanking me for a special favor that I had done for her. And she made this dress out of some very beautiful red brocade, which my mother had brought from the Orient on one of her trips. And this was a party dress, which I wore for evening. And it has since been worn by the lead in Maggie on Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and it has also been worn in a production of Grease.
That is gorgeous. I want to take that one home. That's beautiful. Thank you very much. Our next model is Alanna Landman, and she's wearing a 60s formal.
Yes, in 1963, our whole family sailed on the Lurleen for Hawaii, and one of the special occasions on a cruise is a cocktail dress that you would wear to the captain's dinner, and this dress was worn by me for the captain's dinner and for several other occasions on that beautiful trip of 5 days across the Pacific to Honolulu.
Looks like a perfect dress for that environment.
Well, it was such a happy trip that I saved the dress as a memory.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Our next model is Jerry Patkey again, and she is wearing a 60s bridesmaid dress.
This dress was worn by my oldest daughter for my niece's, her cousin's wedding in the 60s. And it had a very beautiful little headpiece, which has since been lost. But you will notice there is a suggestion of a train at the back. And there were 4 bridesmaids in the wedding, and they were all dressed in this very beautiful shade of aqua blue.
Mm-hmm. That is lovely, the color. We don't see too many colors along those lines in weddings nowadays.
Not so much, not so much. They're a little more dramatic. This is a very traditional dress in style.
Thank you very much. And our last model is Janet Freeland, and Janet is wearing a hippie or 60s dress.
Actually, late 60s, early 70s. the flower child movement came out with this type of dress, the very somber, long cotton flower dress, and the love beads, and the flowers in the hair, very typical of the flower child of the Vietnam War era. And we kept it, not because it's our favorite time to remember, but because we think that something should remain from that era, which was very important in our country. A very important era to young people and to the whole country as well.
It certainly was, wasn't it? Well, let's bring our models out one last time and see all of the fashions together and how they span the century, from the early part of the century all the way through to the 1960s. And you can see how the dresses have carried over into the 90s, some of the fashions.
Yes, you'll see a replication of several of these styles in the dresses that we're wearing today. If you take a very close look, you'll see that what goes around comes around, and fashion cycles, change, and then come back into fashion again.
Beautiful. Well, we'd like to thank our models for coming this evening and thank our viewers for joining us this evening on Los Altos History. We hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.